Hi, welcome back. We are reading The Veil of Isis by Pierre Hadot. Chapter 4 Heraclitus' Aphorism and Allegorical Exegesis. Before I set forth the way both ancients and moderns tried to unveil and discover the secrets of nature, it may be useful to investigate what became of Heraclitus' famous saying in antiquity: theological physics. It took 5 centuries for a citation of this aphorism by Heraclitus, which is one of the main themes of the present work, to appear explicitly attributed to our author. As I have hinted in the preceding pages, the evolution of the notion of physis and the appearance of the metaphor of the secrets of nature led philosophers to believe that Heraclitus's aphorism meant nature loves to conceal herself. Since the metaphor of the secrets of nature was quite widespread at the time of this reappearance, we might expect that our aphorism would have been cited to illustrate the difficulties man experiences in knowing natural phenomena and in constructing the physical part of philosophy. This, however, is not the case. When the saying was quoted by Philo of Alexandria at the beginning of the Christian era, and by Porphyry, by Julian, and by Themistius in the 3rd and 4th centuries, although its subject is the word nature, it was always applied to the divine, or the gods, and to discourse on the gods, that is, to theology. Julian the Apostate, for instance, speaks in this context of telestic and mystagogic theology. This fact can be explained in the following way. Whereas the word theology evokes for us metaphysical considerations that pertain to the dogmas of a religion or to sacred texts, matters were quite otherwise for the Greeks. Theology meant a discourse on the gods, and the word was first used with regard to that discourse on the gods, exemplified by the works of poets such as Homer, Hesiod, and Orpheus. These poets used the religious representation and myths handed down by tradition, which sometimes came from the Near East, to tell the story of the genealogy of the gods and thereby give a primitive explanation of the genesis of things. By personifying natural phenomena, for instance, the sky, Oranos, impregnates the earth, Gaia, by means of the rain it sprinkled down. We ought not, therefore, to be surprised if the words physiologia, or discourse on nature, and theologia, or discourse on the gods, are closely connected, as they are in this text by Plutarch, the Platonist philosopher of the 1st century CE. That among the ancients, Greeks as well as barbarians, physiologia was a discourse on nature that was wrapped in myths, or a theology most often disguised by enigmas and hidden meanings, and pertaining to the mysteries, and that for the crowd what is said is more obscure than what is not said, and that what is not said is even more problematic than what is said. This is obvious when we consider the Orphic poems and the Egyptian and Phrygian discourses. Yet it is especially the secret rites of the initiations and what is carried out symbolically in religious ceremonies that reveal the thought of the ancients. Thus, rituals and myths contained a hidden teaching on the subject of nature. The encounter between this poetic theology, linked moreover to pagan cults, and philosophical reflection was the subject of controversy. The mythical representation of the gods was criticized by those who were called the Phusikoi, who gave a purely material explanation for the birth of the world. Philosophers such as Xenophanes and Exegesis openly attacked poetic theology. In the 5th century BCE, with the sophists, there developed a veritable Aufklärung, or century of enlightenment, when the existence of the gods was questioned on the grounds that it was a mere poetic fiction or social convention. Because of this, philosophers of the Platonic and Stoic traditions gradually developed a kind of doctrine of double truth. On the one hand, poetic and religious traditions were left intact, since they were useful for the people, as forming the basis of the education of children and of the official religion of the city-state. On the other hand, these philosophers considered that the poets of yesteryear had, in an enigmatic or hidden way, taught an entire science of nature beneath the veil of myth, which was none other than the Platonic or Stoic science of nature. Through skillful exegesis, called allegorical exegesis, allegorein means to make someone understand something other than what is said. A hidden philosophical meaning was discovered under the letter of the texts. As Émile Brehier pointed out, the need for this method came to be felt when, as a result of the evolution of thought, traditional forms had to be reconciled with new ideas. This phenomenon had already appeared in the 6th century BCE in a commentator on Homer, Theogenes of Rhegium, whose work is unfortunately known only through late citations, but who seems to have proposed an allegorical exegesis of the Homeric poems that was physical. The battle of the gods becomes the battle of the elements, and moral, perhaps in reaction against the sharp criticisms formulated against Homeric mythology by Xenophanes. In the 4th century, the famous Derveni papyrus proposed an allegorical explanation of an Orphic poem in an exegesis that seeks to find a hidden teaching of a physical nature in the text being commented upon. Here, the Zeus of the Orphic poem was identified with the air. In a manner reminiscent of Diogenes of Apollonia, Plato's disciple Xenocrates gave divine names to the elements, and even Aristotle did not disdain to provide an allegorical interpretation of Homer's golden chain to illustrate his theory of the prime mover. Yet it was above all the Stoics who used this method systematically in the theological part of their physics. For example, they interpreted the myth of the birth of Athena emerging from the head of Zeus as a function of their theory according to which the organ of thought is situated in the chest. As Athena was identified with thought, it was said that she was produced from Zeus's chest, since thought is manifested in the voice. Again, Hera's fellation of Zeus, represented in a painting at Samos, reflected for them the way in which matter receives seminal reasons within itself with a view to the organization of the world. The Stoics thus tried to present their physical doctrines, deduced from the principles of their philosophy, or inspired by the pre-Socratics, by dressing them up in the mythical garb borrowed from the texts of Homer and Hesiod. Speaking of their exegetical method, Cicero gives a good statement of what was in fact proper to all allegorical exegesis, and this also holds for contemporary methods of the interpretation of texts. He writes, Chrysippus claims to adapt the fabulous tales of Orpheus, Hesiod, and Homer in such a way that the ancient poets, who never had the slightest idea of their theories, are transformed into Stoics. Impressive feats of ingenuity were thus deployed to make it possible to find modern doctrines in texts written several centuries previously. The eventual result was the rationalization of religious traditions. As Cotta says to the Stoic Balbus in Cicero's dialogue on the nature of the gods, when you give yourself such trouble to account for these fables, you thereby admit that reality is quite different from what men believe it to be. What they call gods are natural processes, rerum naturas, not figures of the gods. The Stoics would certainly have accepted this conclusion, replying that the only God is nature. In their view, the different gods of mythology were merely various representations of the one God, who is nature. Unlike other philosophers who practiced the allegorical method, the Stoics were not content to identify the gods and goddesses with the physical elements, but they did consider that these various gods were only the successive forms assumed by one and the same force. In this regard, I cite the summary by Diogenes Laertius. God is the father of all things, both generally and in that part of him that penetrates throughout all things and receives multiple appellations according to his powers. Indeed, he is called Dia, because all things exist because of Dia, him. Zeus, insofar as he is the cause of life, or as he penetrates life thoroughly. Athena, because of the extension of his guiding part in the ether. Hera, because of his extension in the air. Hephaestus, because of his extension in the fire that produces things. Poseidon, because of his extension in what is wet. And Demeter, because of his extension in the earth. The Stoics had a dynamic conception of nature. The biological model that inspired them was the seed, which develops in accordance with a predetermined program and constructs an organism. In its expansive phase, the primordial force that contains the original seed successively adopts the various forms of the elements, which are to constitute the cosmos. Then it concentrates once again, so that the cosmos is annihilated and the force remains alone. Then it deploys itself again to engender the same cosmos, once again and eternally. To describe this process, allegorical exegesis presented Zeus's action as the transformation of Zeus into Athena, then Hera, and so on. The universe was thus subject to periods, that is, an infinite succession of diastoles and systoles. More precisely, nature was God in its expansive phase. Seneca says that nature, the creative and destructive process, comes to an end at the conclusion of each period, cessante natura, when Zeus becomes concentrated within himself. Ultimately, these divine names serve only to give an imaged and personified definition of the phases of the universe, and they enable us to glimpse how Stoic doctrine was already sketched in the most ancient traditions. At the same time, however, the literal meaning of this mythology could remain valid just as it was for the common people, since philosophers knew that it had a hidden philosophical meaning. We can thus discern, at least in the Stoic tradition, and perhaps in the Platonic tradition as well, a twofold aspect of physics. First of all, there is physics in the proper sense, which applies itself to studying the structure of bodies, the movements, and the causes of natural phenomena. Yet there is also a part of physics that must speak of the gods, since mythical traditions and religion place them in relation to the phenomena of nature. This is a physics that is theological, uses the method of allegorical exegesis, and is therefore the noblest part of philosophy. With regard to it, Cleanthes and Chrysippus go so far as to speak of mysterial initiation. Moreover, we must distinguish three primary meanings of the word theology. The word may designate the mythical system implied in ancient theogonies or religious texts. It can also refer to the allegorical exegesis of myths. Finally, it may mean the theory of first principles, as presented by Plato, Aristotle, or the Neoplatonists. For those who cite Heraclitus' aphorism, from the 1st to the 4th centuries of our era, the nature that hides was therefore divine nature, whether it was the divine in general or the various gods that are present in nature. For instance, the geographer Strabo certainly seems to allude to this aphorism when, with regard to mysterious ceremonies such as those of Ulysses, he speaks of the secret and the mystery in which these mysterious ceremonies magnify the divine, for they imitate the nature of the divine, which escapes our senses. It seems to me very likely, although no text attests to it clearly, that the Stoics were the first to establish this relation between Heraclitus's nature that hides and the divine that is wrapped up in myths and unveiled by allegory. Philo of Alexandria. The first explicit citation of Heraclitus' aphorism appears in an author who is rather marginal in the prospective Greek tradition, Philo the Jew of Alexandria. His work would probably have been completely forgotten if Christian writers had not become interested in him, taking him as a model in their attempt at the recuperation of Greek philosophy and the allegorical exegesis of the Hebraic Bible. His commentaries on the Greek version of the Bible conserve for us a great deal of precious information on Greek philosophy, Platonic or Stoic, which he knew either through the education he had received or else owing to the tradition of Jewish commentators who had preceded him. If Philo used the allegorical method abundantly, it was precisely in order to find allusions to concepts of Greek philosophy in the characters of the Bible or the actions they carry out. For instance, he recognizes the four cardinal virtues of the Stoics in the four rivers of paradise mentioned in Genesis. Philo, however, did not invent the application of allegorical exegesis to the text of the Bible. He often alludes to his predecessors, whom he calls the Phusikoi, Jewish commentators on the Bible, who establish a correspondence between the biblical stories and the phenomena of nature, and who therefore influenced by Stoic allegorism. As a matter of fact, the context in which the quotation from Heraclitus appears in Philo is rather obscure. The Greek text is lost, but we still have an Armenian translation of it, commenting on the biblical verse, "The Lord God appeared to Abraham at the oak of Mamre." Philo is supposed to have written, "The literal sense seems quite clear to me. However, only the tree contains an allegorical meaning, which must be explained by the Chaldean language in the word Mamre. According to Heraclitus, the tree is our nature, which loves to conceal itself and to hide." Obviously, Heraclitus never said that the tree is our nature and that our nature loves to conceal itself. There's certainly been a mistake in translation in the transition from the Greek to the Armenian. In the Greek, the allusion to Heraclitus was no doubt intended to justify the need for using the allegorical method along the lines of, We must explain what is meant by the opum mambrae, for according to Heraclitus, nature loves to hide. In fact, it is the word mambrae that will be the subject of an allegorical interpretation, since, says Philo, it meant etymologically that which comes from sight, and hence the act of seeing. We might also consider that the text means that divine nature loves to conceal itself, and that here it is concealed in a human form. The first text by Philo is interesting because it brings up the name of Heraclitus, but the other mentions of our aphorism are much clearer. Commenting on Genesis 2:6, a spring rose up from the earth. Philo writes, those who are not initiated in the allegory and nature who loves to hide compare the river in question to the river of Egypt. For his part, Philo considers that the spring, in conformity with Stoic doctrine, represents the guiding part of our soul. Like a spring, it pours into the five powers of sensation. Those who are unaware of Heraclitus' aphorism search for literalist interpretations. If the Bible speaks of a spring, then it must mean the birth of a river. By contrast, those who, like Philo, know that nature loves to hide, try to discover that something else which is meant by the biblical text. In the continuation of his commentary, Philo goes on to develop everything that suggests the theme of springs, for instance, the springs of virtue, or else the source of life, which is none other than God. For Philo, Heraclitus' aphorism is therefore an invitation to derive all kinds of instructive and edifying considerations from the biblical text by searching for analogies that can be drawn between the physical reality designated by the text, for example, in our text, the spring, and spiritual realities that can be conceived as sources in the figurative sense. Etymology is also revealing. God changed Abram's name to Abraham, and such name changes, says Philo, are symbols of nature who always loves to hide. Philo illustrates his statement by declaring that Abram means father who rises, while Abraham means father of sound. And by the use of an erudite argument, he concludes that the change from Abram to Abraham corresponds to the transformation of a person who progresses from the study of nature to the practice of wisdom, or from physics to ethics. Here I can sense the reader's impatience. He must be saying to himself, with cause, what is this nature whose unveiling ultimately boils down to the discovery of a hidden meaning of the sacred text? I will answer first of all that Philo's task is not to carry out, like the Stoics, an exegesis of the names of the gods, which refer ultimately to cosmic processes. Instead, he wants to give an exegesis of the historical facts or legal prescriptions transmitted by the Bible. It is the true meaning hidden in these formulas that must be discovered, for in all probability, phusis in Philo is synonymous with aletheia, that is, nature and truth are closely connected. Both are symbolized by the same reality mentioned by the Bible, the well. Speaking of the biblical wells, Philo alludes to an opposition between the surface and the depths of knowledge. The well is the symbol of knowledge, for the nature of knowledge is not situated at the surface, but it is deep. It does not sprawl in daylight, but loves to hide in secret, and it is not found easily, but with a great deal of difficulty. Although the subject is the nature of knowledge, we can obviously discern an allusion to Heraclitus' aphorism here. Yet we are also in the presence of an interesting encounter, which will be reproduced several times, between Heraclitus' aphorism and an aphorism of Democritus, promoted to the rank of a proverb, according to which, in the testimony of the Christian writer Lactantius, the truth is hidden in a well. Democritus attests that the truth is plunged within a deep well. Democritus, for his part, had simply said, we know nothing in reality, for the truth is within a deep abyss. Philo is quite probably thinking of this truth hidden in the depths. Already prior to him, Cicero had compared the two sayings in speaking of the philosophers of the New Academy, who proposed a purely aporetic philosophy, and who, in response to those who protested to them that nothing is certain anymore according to their way of thinking, replied, what can we do about that? Is it our fault? It is nature that must be accused. She who, as Democritus says, has completely hidden truth in an abyss. Heraclitus' nature, Cicero seems to say, has hidden Democritus' truth in the abyss. What interests us, however, both in Cicero and in Philo, is that in this perspective, there's a kind of identification between nature and truth. Both are hidden and both are very hard to find. At the end of his natural questions, Seneca urges us to summon all our strength to devote ourselves to the discovery of this nature and this truth. It is only with great difficulty that we can reach this abyss in which truth has been deposited. Yet we seek this truth only on the surface and with hands that lack vigor. As a matter of fact, aletheia means, as it often does in Greek, not so much truth in the sense of agreement between reality and thought, as reality in an ontological sense, and phusis can have the same meaning, whereas the word phusis is often used by Philo to designate either the nature that produces beings, or else the general course of nature, or the nature of a thing, or finally, in a Stoic sense, the life proper to plants. When it comes to biblical exegesis, Philo understands by the word phusis the hidden reality or truth that must be discovered beyond the letter of the text by means of allegory, a reality or truth that is incorporeal and ultimately divine. For instance, the names of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob hint at a reality, phusis, that is less apparent and far superior to that of sensible objects. Because for Philo, these characters correspond allegorically to the three elements that constitute virtue: innate dispositions, theoretical teaching, and practical exercise. He states this explicitly. What is said in the Bible does not stop at the limits of literal and obvious explanation, but seems to hint at a reality, phusis, that is much more difficult to know for the multitude, one that is recognized by those who rank the intelligible before the sensible, and who are able to see. Here we could almost translate phusis as meaning, as opposed to the letter of the text. Reality is the true meaning. We find an analogous shift in Latin, where the word res means thing, or reality, can in some contexts mean the true signification of a word. Be that as it may, phusis, in the perspective of allegorical exegesis, corresponds to a conceptual content and an incorporeal reality. By opposing somata, or bodies, to pragmata, and by this term he means incorporeal realities, Philo considers that only those who are able to consider intelligible realities, pragmata, in their separation from bodies and their nakedness, are capable of practicing allegory. I want to read that again. By opposing somata, or bodies, to pragmata, and by this term he means incorporeal realities, Philo considers that only those who are able to consider intelligible realities, as in pragmata, in their separation from bodies and their nakedness, are capable of practicing allegory. We can assume that the reason why nature loves to hide for Philo is that it is not accessible, but is situated in the vast domain of the incorporeal, from psychic realities to divine reality, which mortals have great difficulty understanding. Philonian allegory is thus quite different from Stoic allegory. Whereas Stoic allegory reveals that myths correspond to corporeal realities, that is, living and animated, it is incorporeal realities that Philonian allegory discovers in this biblical text. Such allegory is therefore Platonic in inspiration and foreshadows the allegory of the Neoplatonists. Let me add that this movement of thought, which in the reading of a sacred text rises from the sensible to the intelligible, is a spiritual exercise that Christians too would love to practice as they read the Bible.